I came home balancing 2 paper bags against my hip, still warm from the late afternoon sun. The grocery store had been quiet the way it often is on a weekday. I'd taken my time in the produce aisle, picking the firmest apples, the freshest lettuce, even splurging on a loaf of rosemary bread. Small comforts matter when life feels heavy. As I pushed the door open with my shoulder, the familiar creak of the hinges greeted me. But there was something else. An odd stillness, the kind that makes you pause without knowing why. Before we start the story, if you love heartfelt, emotional stories about life, family, and second chances, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next one that might speak straight to your heart. That's when I saw it. A single sheet of lined paper sitting in the middle of the kitchen counter, folded in half. My name wasn't on the outside, but I knew. The handwriting, slanted, hurried, was Tyler's. My hands hesitated over the note. I wasn't prepared for words that could change the shape of my life. I unfolded it anyway. "No space for you here anymore, Mom. You'll figure something out." My first reaction wasn't anger. It was stillness. The kind of stillness that falls over a landscape just before a storm tears it apart. I read it again, slower, as though the meaning might soften if I lingered on each word. But it didn't. Each letter cut sharper the second time. My fingers loosened and the note fluttered onto the counter. The grocery bag slid from my arms and hit the floor. Apples rolled across the tile, the rosemary bread collapsed under its own weight. I didn't bend to pick them up. I just stood there, staring at the paper as if doing so could somehow make Tyler appear and explain himself. But the house answered only in silence. I called his name, once, twice. My voice sounded wrong, too thin. I walked down the hall to his room. Empty. Not messy, not half-packed. Empty. The bed frame bare, the closet stripped, even the scuff marks where his desk used to be had been scrubbed away. It was the kind of emptiness you see in a place where someone wants no trace left behind. It wasn't just that he had left. It was the precision with which he had erased himself from this space. And me from his. I sat on the edge of his bed frame, my hands resting in my lap, trying to stitch together a reason. We hadn't fought. At least nothing big enough to warrant this. I'd made him breakfast that morning the way I often did. Toast, eggs, coffee, just how he liked it. He'd mumbled a distracted thanks before heading out. I assumed he'd gone to run errands or see friends. I had no idea it was the last morning we'd share under the same roof. I thought about all the times over the years when the roles had been reversed. When I'd picked him up from soccer practice in the rain, when I'd left work early to attend school meetings, when I'd stayed awake through the night during his bouts of teenage flu, whispering reassurances into the darkness. The quiet, constant work of motherhood doesn't ask for applause. But it doesn't expect a folded eviction notice in return either. I moved back to the kitchen, the note still sitting there like a verdict. My reflection in the window above the sink caught my eye. Face drawn, hair a little too wind-tossed from my walk home. But it was my eyes that held me. They looked unfamiliar. Tired, yes, but also hollow in a way I hadn't seen before. I wasn't just losing my home. I was being told, without words, that I was disposable. The cruelty wasn't loud. It didn't come in the form of shouting or slammed doors. It was surgical. Precise. He hadn't even given me the dignity of a conversation, a goodbye, or a reason. Just a note. Just a folded piece of paper that would take years to forget. I tried to imagine what he was thinking as he wrote it. Was there hesitation? Regret? Or was it quick, the way you jot down a grocery list? I would never know. Outside, the late day light had started to shift, painting long shadows across the porch. It should have been a comfort, that familiar change of hour. But instead, it made the house feel even emptier, like the walls were leaning in to remind me I was alone here now. I picked up the note again, folded it along the original crease, and slipped it into my purse without really knowing why. Maybe I needed proof that it happened. Or maybe, deep down, I knew this was the first page of a story I hadn't chosen to start, but one I would eventually finish. That night, I didn't unpack the groceries. I didn't cook. I didn't even turn on the lights as darkness spread through the house. I sat at the kitchen table, the silence pressing down like a heavy quilt, until I realized something that would echo in me for months to come. Tyler thought he'd taken my place away from me. But maybe what he'd really done was hand me a blank space. and I had no idea yet just how much I could build inside it. I sat in that dim kitchen long after the daylight drained away, the note still heavy in my purse as though it had weight beyond its paper. My thoughts wandered backward, searching for the fault line, where the earth shifted between Tyler and me. I had built my life around him. Not in the overbearing way people sometimes warn against, but in the quiet, steady devotion that comes when you're all a child has. I was both the roof and the floor for him, the container that caught his falls and the shelter that kept the storms off his back. When he was young, we were inseparable. I can still see his small hand gripping mine as we crossed streets, hear the lilt in his voice when he'd call, "Mom," across a playground. But life has a way of trading sweetness for strain. There were years when money was too thin to stretch over both of us, and I learned the arithmetic of sacrifice. 2 shifts back-to-back, jewelry pawned for tuition, vacations quietly erased from the calendar so his needs would always come first. I put him in a private school not because I thought we were better than anyone, but because I believed it was the surest way to open doors for him that had been closed to me. I told myself the endless nights and aching feet from double shifts were temporary investments in his future. I covered his rent more than once when a job disappeared or he was figuring things out. When he fell into debt, I made phone calls, rearranged my own bills, and told him he'd pay me back when he could. He rarely did, but I didn't keep score. Love isn't supposed to be a ledger. Somewhere along the way, though, I became less a mother and more a fixture. Not the centerpiece, not the beating heart, just a piece of furniture you forget to notice until it's in your way. When his leases ended or relationships soured, I became his safety net. I convinced myself that meant he still needed me. But over time I began to sense the shift. He wasn't inviting me into his life, he was tolerating me in it. My presence was convenient when it filled a gap, but disposable when it didn't. Friends noticed before I did. "He's using you," one of them said bluntly over coffee. I bristled at that. Using me? This was my son. My only child. I told myself they didn't understand the closeness between us, the history we'd shared. I believed that no matter what else eroded between us, family loyalty would anchor him to me as I had always been anchored to him. But loyalty, I would learn, can be a one-way street. Standing there in that kitchen with the note's cold message rattling around in my mind, the truth sharpened until it cut. This wasn't about a disagreement or a misunderstanding. It was about the quiet reclassification of who I was in his life. I was no longer a mother he turned to, I was an obligation he wanted to unload. And rather than have the courage to say that to my face, he had condensed it into a single dismissive sentence. It's a strange thing when love and reality part ways. You can still feel the muscle memory of affection, the instinct to protect, even as you absorb the fact that the person you love doesn't see you that way anymore. That contradiction sits heavy, pressing down until it forces one of two choices: shrink to fit their view of you or step outside of it entirely. For the first time, I began to wonder if I had been holding on to an image of Tyler that no longer existed, or maybe never had. Had I mistaken dependence for closeness? Had I called comfort what was really habit? Those questions felt dangerous because answering them meant rewriting the entire history I'd built between us. But the note in my purse left little room for illusions. I thought of the times in recent years when his invitations to stay with him came only after a breakup, a move, or a financial stumble. I remembered the careful way he avoided making long-term plans with me, as though my presence was always meant to be temporary. And now the folded paper on my counter was the full stop at the end of that sentence. A slow, unfamiliar heat began to form in my chest. Not the sharp burn of rage, that would have been easier, more immediate, but the deep ember glow of something older, heavier. Quiet rage. The kind that doesn't flare up and burn out, but smolders in a steady, unblinking way. It wasn't about revenge. It was about finally seeing clearly what had been true for longer than I wanted to admit. I had been reduced to a footnote in my own family. An afterthought in the story I had worked so hard to write. The temptation in moments like this is to collapse into the smallness someone else assigns you. To accept their version of your worth because it's easier than standing alone. But as I sat there staring at the darkened windows, a different thought pressed its way in. If I was no longer part of his plan, then maybe, just maybe, I could start thinking about a plan of my own. The note was meant to push me out, Instead, it might have pushed me toward the one thing I hadn't considered in years. A life that was mine alone to build. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of cardboard and tape. I didn't have the luxury of a slow goodbye to the life I'd been living. Tyler's note had made sure of that. So I packed in silence, moving room to room like a guest who had overstayed. Every object seemed heavier than it was, weighted with memories I wasn't sure I could carry. I sorted my life into piles. Keep, donate, throw away. And then there were the boxes I couldn't decide on, things too tangled with history to let go of, but too raw to live with just yet. A small storage unit on the edge of town became my compromise. A space barely larger than a walk-in closet, smelling faintly of dust and concrete, with a roll-up metal door that clanged like finality when I pulled it down. I stacked my boxes in neat, narrow rows, labeling them with a black marker: kitchen, winter clothes, photos, miscellaneous. That last label did a lot of heavy lifting. It was the box for the pieces of my life I couldn't name. Somewhere in the middle of this moving ballet, I found myself at the old cedar trunk that had followed me through every home I'd lived in. It was scratched and scuffed now, its brass latch tarnished, but it still carried the faint, sweet smell of the cedar inside. I had always kept the less important keepsakes in there. Old tax returns, expired warranties, faded greeting cards. It was a place where papers went to be forgotten. As I sifted through brittle manila folders, I came across an envelope that stopped me mid-motion. My name was written across the front in my brother David's handwriting, looping and slanted, the way he'd always signed birthday cards. A sudden pang went through me. David had been gone for over 20 years. I hadn't seen this envelope since before his funeral. I sat down cross-legged on the storage unit's cold floor and ran my thumb over the writing, almost afraid to open it. Inside were several crisp sheets of paper, neatly folded, along with a thin stack of printed certificates. The heading on the certificates read, "Share Ownership, Green Haven Energy Incorporated." I frowned. I remembered now. David had worked for a small green energy startup in his 20s. He'd been convinced they were going to change the world. On a visit home, he had pressed these into my hands, telling me they might be worth something one day. I had smiled, humored him, and tucked them away. If you're feeling this story so far, go ahead and tap the like button. It really helps more people find these stories and join our little community here. Life had been too loud back then. Tyler was still in school, I was juggling work and bills, and a speculative investment in some idealistic company felt like a luxury for people who had breathing room. I never thought of them again. Till now. I turned one over, reading the fine print. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the company name was still sharp. A date stamped in the corner, nearly 3 decades old. My first instinct was to dismiss them again. How many small companies like that burned bright and then vanished without a trace? The odds were overwhelming. And yet, I didn't throw them away. Something about holding them now in this moment felt different. It wasn't just nostalgia for my brother, though that was there in full measure. It was the fact that I had nothing left to lose. My life had been emptied out, physically into boxes, emotionally into a void I hadn't learned to name. I had been erased from my own home in the space of an afternoon. Maybe that's why my fingers didn't want to let go of these flimsy papers. I slipped them back into the envelope and put it in my handbag, not the miscellaneous box. That decision didn't make sense even to me. It wasn't as though I was going to rush to a broker and demand answers. I just knew I didn't want to leave them here in this place of temporary storage, where forgotten things went to finish disappearing. By the time I locked the unit and stepped into the pale winter light, I was exhausted. Not just from the labor of moving, but from the feeling that my entire identity had been folded into those boxes, tucked away behind a metal door. My old life was in storage now, waiting like me for something to change. As I drove away, I kept glancing at the passenger seat where my handbag sat. Inside it, the envelope pressed invisibly against the lining as if it carried a pulse. I told myself it was nothing, just a relic from a brother who had believed in windmills and solar panels before the rest of the world cared. But there was an unsettled hum in my chest that wouldn't quiet. Maybe it was the ache of leaving my home. Or maybe it was something else. Something that felt almost like the faintest spark of possibility. I didn't know it then, but that spark was about to burn brighter than I could imagine. And when it did, it would change everything, not just for my bank account but for the way I saw myself in a world that had tried to pack me away. The envelope stayed in my bag like a secret I wasn't ready to read. Weeks turned into months and I almost forgot it was there. My life had become a careful rhythm of small survival. Working part-time at the library, sharing a rented room above a florist shop, stretching every dollar until it almost tore. I told myself I was fine. After all, I had a roof, I had work, and I had quiet. Quiet was better than the tension that had lived in Tyler's house. But quiet can also be dangerous. It leaves space for thoughts you've been avoiding to slip in and sit with you. One rainy afternoon, while I was reorganizing my little room, the envelope slipped out from between a stack of old letters. I stared at my brother's handwriting for a long time before opening it. The shares were exactly as I remembered. Thin paper, company name across the top, David's faith embedded in every word. I ran my finger over the name, Green Haven Energy Incorporated. I didn't know why, but that unsettled hum in my chest returned. I pulled my laptop closer and typed the name into the search bar, expecting nothing more than a notice about a company long dissolved. The screen loaded and I froze. Not only was Green Haven still around, it was everywhere. There were articles about record-breaking stock prices, interviews with the CEO about leading the global shift to renewable energy, photos of sprawling wind farms and glittering solar arrays stretching to the horizon. My heart thudded as I read words like market leader and multi-billion-dollar valuation. Surely this wasn't the same Green Haven my brother had joined in his 20s. Maybe the name had been recycled the way small companies are forgotten and replaced. But there was something about the logo, modernized now but still carrying the seed of the one I remembered, that made my breath catch. On impulse, I clicked to their investor relations page. There was a phone number. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my mind ping-ponging between you look foolish and what if? My hands were cold as I picked up the phone. I told myself it was just to settle my curiosity, nothing more. A woman answered, warm but professional. I explained I had old share certificates, decades old, and asked if they could tell me if they meant anything. I half expected her to laugh, to tell me they were meaningless scraps. Instead, her tone sharpened with interest. "Can you hold for a moment?" she asked. The hold music was soft piano, but my pulse drowned it out. When she came back, she transferred me to someone in what she called their acquisitions team. A man's voice came on the line, brisk and focused. He asked for the certificate numbers, the issue date, my name. I read them slowly, almost afraid the words would evaporate before they reached him. He repeated the information back to me, tapping on a keyboard. Then he paused. "Mrs. Clark, are you sitting down?" I was. But I still gripped the edge of the desk like I might float away. "These shares," he said carefully, "are valid. In fact, they've split multiple times over the years. Based on our current market value, your holdings would be worth." He gave a number and for a moment I thought I'd misheard. I asked him to repeat it. He did. Just over $1.4 million. There was a silence that followed, a silence that wasn't just between him and me. It was inside me, as if the world had gone still to make space for what I'd just learned. My brother's dream, that stack of paper I'd nearly left in a dusty storage unit, was a fortune. My fortune. I don't remember much of what I said after that. I think I thanked him, maybe even laughed a little. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hang up the phone. I sat there for a long time staring at nothing. $1.4 million. The number was too big to fit in my old life, the life where I'd scraped by and asked permission for the smallest comforts. And suddenly everything looked different. Not just my finances. Me. The way I saw myself shifted in an instant. I was no longer the discarded mother left to figure things out. I wasn't a burden shuffled from one place to another. I wasn't powerless. I thought of Tyler's note. "You'll figure something out." The irony made me smile, not bitterly but with a kind of quiet wonder. He had no idea that I'd just figured out more than he could ever imagine. I closed my eyes and thought of David. I could almost hear his laugh, the one that always came a beat before the rest of the room caught the joke. I wanted to tell him he'd been right, that his faith in this company had not only changed the world in the way he'd hoped, it had just changed mine. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask about financing or wait to think it over. I wrote a check. Paid in full. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to measure my dreams against my bank balance. The realtor's smile was polite, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, the kind reserved for people who surprise you in the best way. Decorating was a joy I hadn't known I'd missed. I filled the place with what made me happy: soft linen curtains that danced in the breeze, a deep blue armchair that cradled me like an embrace, shelves stacked with the books I'd carried from one cramped rental to another. No one told me which colors worked together, or what I should keep. Every decision was mine and mine alone. In the mornings, I'd wake to the sound of waves and watch the sunlight inch across the water with my coffee in hand. Sometimes I'd stand barefoot on the balcony just to feel the wind on my skin. There was no Tyler barging in with commentary about bills, no unspoken expectation that I'd cook, clean, or make myself scarce. This was my space, purchased with my own hand, shaped by my own taste, protected by my own keys. It wasn't long before I reached out to a few friends I hadn't seen in years. Somewhere in the exhaustion of surviving, I'd let those connections slip away, thinking I'd get back to them when things calmed down. But life rarely calms down on its own. Now I had the time and the peace to invite people in. We'd sit at my small kitchen table with a bottle of wine, talking until the candles burned low, laughter spilling over the sound of the ocean outside. I started painting again too. At first, just little experiments, sketching the curve of the shoreline, layering blues and greens to catch the sea's shifting moods. But the more I painted, the more I felt something loosen inside me. My hands remembered what my heart had been craving: expression without judgment, creation without someone asking what purpose it served. Some afternoons, I wandered into the small galleries scattered through town, leaving quietly folded donations in their envelopes to keep them running. I funded a few community projects, restoring a weathered playground, helping the library host free weekend classes. I never signed my name to these contributions. It felt better to do it quietly, knowing the difference was there whether anyone noticed or not. I didn't tell Tyler about the apartment. I didn't tell him about the shares or the money, or the way my life had shifted like the tide under a full moon. He hadn't asked, and I had no reason to offer. For once, I wasn't building something for him to take or approve of. I was building it for me, and that was enough. Strange, the freedom that comes when you no longer feel the need to prove yourself to anyone. I didn't think about revenge or teaching him a lesson. What would be the point? My joy was no longer tethered to his understanding or his approval. That part of me, the part that waited for him to notice, had been left behind with the boxes in that storage unit. In the evenings, I'd sit on the balcony and watch the fishing boats drift back to shore, their lights twinkling like fireflies against the dark water. I'd think about how a single dusty envelope had rewritten my story, and how the best part of that rewrite wasn't the money itself. It was the space it gave me to breathe, to choose to live. Sometimes, a shadow of the old ache would pass through me, the memory of that note on the counter, the feeling of groceries slipping from my hands. But it didn't hurt the way it once did. Now it was just part of my history, a chapter I'd turned without ever needing to slam it shut. I was no longer a guest in someone else's house. I was the keeper of my own. And every time the tide rolled in against the shore below, I felt a quiet reassurance deep in my bones. I would never again be without a place that was mine. It was late afternoon when I heard the knock. Not the polite tap of a neighbor returning borrowed sugar, but the firm, rhythmic thud of someone who expected to be answered. I opened the door, and there he was, Tyler. My son. Standing on the other side of my threshold for the first time in almost a year. He looked older, though not in the way life seasons a person. This was the kind of wear that comes from running in circles you can't escape. His suit was rumpled, his tie pulled loose like it had given up hours before he did. His eyes darted past me into the apartment, scanning the space as if measuring what it might mean about me, about my life now. "Hey, Mom," he said, and it landed in my ears with the weight of something unfamiliar. He smiled, but it was the kind that strains at the edges. "It's been a while." I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my body between him and the home I had built. "Yes," I said simply. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I wanted him to say what he'd come to say. After a moment he did. "I've been in a bit of a bind." My business, well, it didn't work out. Bad timing, bad market, you know how it goes. He laughed lightly, but there was no humor in it. Then more softly, I could use a little help. Maybe a place to crash until I get things sorted. The air between us felt weighted, thick with the unspoken. The note on the counter. The months of silence. The way he'd decided I was disposable and trusted I would simply figure it out on my own. And now here he was, framing his need in terms that sounded almost casual. I thought about the apartment behind me, the light on the water, the paintings drying on the easel, the books stacked beside the chair where I spent my mornings. This was my sanctuary. My proof that I could build a life out of the ashes of someone else's abandonment. I wasn't about to invite the storm back in. I kept my voice warm but steady. Tyler, I'm sorry things haven't gone well for you. I meant that. Failure is never easy even when it's earned. But I can't offer you a place here. I've got a lot going on and this space isn't set up for guests. Something flickered across his face. Confusion first, then a quick attempt to mask it with acceptance. Right, sure. I get it. I thought maybe we could help each other out. I shook my head gently. I think the best way I can help you is by wishing you well. Truly, I hope things turn around for you. And I did. Not from some saintly place of forgiveness, but because I didn't want to carry the weight of hoping otherwise. He stood there for a beat as if waiting for me to take it back, to soften the edges of what I'd just said. But I didn't. Instead, I gave him a small smile, the same kind you might give a stranger you'll likely never see again. Take care of yourself, Tyler. And with that I closed the door. Not with a slam. Not with a dramatic flourish. Just a quiet, deliberate click of the latch. The moment the door shut, the air inside my apartment felt lighter. I didn't lean against it for support or burst into tears. I simply walked back to my balcony, picked up the cup of tea I'd left there and looked out at the sea. The waves hadn't changed. The sun was still sliding toward the horizon. And for the first time in years, I realized the most powerful thing I'd ever done for myself wasn't finding the money, or buying the apartment, or rebuilding my life from nothing. It was choosing who could and could not step into it. That afternoon I didn't just turn Tyler away. I turned away the version of myself who thought love meant unconditional access, even from those who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with it. And in that small, quiet act I felt something close to peace. The scent of fresh bread filled the apartment long before the first knock at the door. I had been kneading and shaping dough all morning, letting the quiet rhythm of my hands remind me how far I'd come. 1 year ago to the day, I'd stood in another kitchen staring at a note that told me I no longer had a place to belong. Tonight, the table was set for people who chose to be in my life, and for whom I chose to make space. The first guests arrived just as the sun began melting into the horizon. Friends from the art class I'd joined, a neighbor who watered my plants when I traveled, a retired teacher from down the hall who shared my love of poetry. Their faces lit up when they stepped inside, brushing the cool evening air from their coats. The sound of their voices wove through the rooms, lifting the atmosphere into something warm and unshakable. In the kitchen, I pulled the bread from the oven and set it on the counter. It cracked softly as it cooled, releasing a fragrance that carried all the comfort of home. I remembered the nights I had eaten alone in silence, the clatter of a fork against an empty plate the only sound. Those nights had been necessary. They taught me that solitude is not the same as loneliness. But tonight was proof that solitude can give way to community when you open your door to the right people. We gathered around the table I had found in a small antique shop months ago. Its surface bore faint scratches and water rings, the marks of other lives, other meals. I liked that about it. It had its history as I had mine. We passed platters of roasted vegetables and bowls of salad dressed with herbs from my balcony garden. The bread was torn into pieces by eager hands, the butter melting into its soft middle. Laughter rose like a tide, carrying with it stories from the week. A neighbor's cat who had taken up residence in someone else's apartment, a clumsy attempt at salsa dancing, the discovery of a tiny cafe hidden on a side street. I didn't sit back as an observer. I was in the center of it, adding my own stories, my own laughter. At one point I looked around and felt a wave of something deeper than joy. It was recognition. These people saw me, not as someone to be managed or dismissed, but as a whole person worth knowing. And in their company, I realized I no longer carried the constant ache of waiting for Tyler to come around. That wound had closed, replaced by the solid knowledge that my life was full without him. After the plates were cleared and the last of the wine poured, I stood holding my glass in both hands. The chatter quieted, the room turning toward me in expectation. I took a breath and let my eyes meet each face at the table. A year ago, I began, I thought my life had collapsed. I believed I'd been stripped of my home, my family, and my future. But what I didn't know was that losing what I thought I needed was the only way to discover what I truly wanted. Tonight I'm sitting at a table I set in a home I made for myself, with friends I didn't know I'd find. And that, to me, is more than enough. I raised my glass. To resilience, to second chances, and to the people who walk into our lives and choose to stay. Glasses lifted, the sound of crystal touching crystal ringing in the air like a promise. The first sip after a toast always tastes sweeter, and tonight it carried the weight of truth. I thought of Tyler then, not with bitterness but with a kind of distant clarity. He had been the one to close the door on me, but I had been the one to decide not to reopen it. In the space he left behind I'd planted something new. And it had grown, wild and beautiful, into a life richer than anything he could have offered, or taken away. The night went on, the candles burning lower, the conversation stretching comfortably into the hours when the city outside was quiet. When my guests finally stood to leave, there were hugs at the door, laughter spilling into the hallway, promises to meet again soon. After the last goodbye, I closed the door and leaned against it, not from weariness but from the deep, grounding satisfaction that comes when you know you've made it to the other side of something you once thought would break you. The apartment was still fragrant with bread and the faint scent of candle wax. I walked to the balcony and stepped into the cool night air. The ocean shimmered in the distance, a dark silver ribbon beneath the moon. I thought of all the dinners to come, all the faces yet to gather around my table. And I felt, with a certainty I hadn't known a year ago, that I would never again wonder where I belonged. I belonged here, in my home, in my life, surrounded not by the family I was given, but by the family I had chosen. And in that choice I had found my truest wealth. Now it's your turn. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What's one lesson from this story you'll carry with you? I read every single one, and your stories matter here.